keep us sort of running on time. So let me get going. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. Thank you for joining us for the second distinguished lecture in this series by Professor Athanassios Fokas. I do want to take a moment to mention something about the HDAA, that the HDAA is a global organization connecting scholars in Greece with members of the Greek and Cypriot diaspora, and its mission is to provide pathways to scholarly excellence through collaboration for knowledge creation and dissemination, research, education, and mentorship. And one of the prime vehicles that we have sort of selected to that effect is this lecture series, where we invite some of the people whose thoughts, ideas, and perspectives we'd like to share with all of you and to listen to as a sort of starting point for more of these collaborations and joinings between Greece and its diaspora. And so it's a great pleasure in that regard, personally for me, but also more generally, I think, for the HDAA, to have someone of the caliber of Athanassios Fokas joining us today and giving the second lecture in this series. I'll just say a few words. I could go on for like many minutes to just describe the accolades of Professor Fokas, but just to give you a brief overview, he graduated from Imperial College with his bachelor's degree in 1975. He got his PhD from Caltech in 1979. One of the most impressive things for me is that in addition to his getting a PhD in applied mathematics, he went on to get an MD in 1986 from the University of Miami. He then was selected to chair the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science at Clarkson. And later in 1996, he got a chair of applied mathematics at Imperial College. He got the Naylor Prize for his celebrated work on the so-called Fokas method in 2000. This is one of the most prestigious prizes, if not the most prestigious prize in applied mathematics and theoretical physics in the UK. And then he was appointed in 2002 in the newly inaugurated chair in nonlinear mathematical science at the University of Cambridge. He has many accolades and distinctions, as I mentioned. He has the Aristion Prize in the sciences from the Academy of Athens, the Excellence Prize of the Bodosaki Foundation, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a full membership of the Academy of Athens, a membership of the European Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the list kind of goes on and on and on. He has been decorated with a Commander of the Order of the Phoenix by the President of the Greek Republic, and he is also appointed as an ambassador of Hellenism in 2010. And also he was Neo-Nazi Senior Visiting Scholar at the University of Harvard in 2012. He has written many papers. I happen to be in his area of research, broadly speaking, nonlinear waves. I have been impacted by many of his works. He is also extremely broad and diverse. So his work spans not only nonlinear partial differential equations, applied mathematics, and nonlinear waves, but also much more applied topics in chronic myelogenous leukemia, protein folding, mathematical models of COVID-19, and many other areas. He has introduced this transformative method that I talked about, the Fokas method for solving partial differential equations. This is considered to be one of the most significant developments in recent times, in recent decades of the subject. And it is really a great pleasure for me to have him today joining us and talking about the grand illusion and the two big bangs in our mental evolution. Thanassi, the floor is yours.
See, Panayotis, thank you very much. The only problem is that you are a very close friend of mine. Therefore, naturally, you're biased towards me. And the audience should understand that this very generous introduction should be viewed within this bias of our friendship. But I also want to thank you for introducing me to your organization and for arranging this talk. And you see, always with talks, I have this problem that I'm always a bit nervous. And this is the reason why generally I avoid talks. However, on the other hand, I understand the need to communicate ideas, especially in this forum. And today, maybe this talk you will hear today is perhaps the most complete talk of this type. I have been thinking about these ideas for a long time, and these ideas go back to essentially to our ancestors, and even before that, because as you know, the ancient Greeks were truly remarkable. The more one studies them, the more one is impressed. And from the point of view of today's talk, it is important to note that, in a sense, they were the first to think about thinking. In the sense, they were first to provide the basis of what could be called theoretical, or the background of theoretical neuroscience. So the basic question that my talk relates to is, how do we comprehend? How do we comprehend? Extremely basic question, which the Greeks, of course, addressed, and related to this question is the question of knowledge. How do we learn? And as you know, there was a tremendous conflict of opinion between Aristotle and later Locke and others, and Plato, later Immanuel Kant, etc., with the idea of tabula rasa versus tabula inscripta. Great number of philosophers. I mean, it's impossible to summarize their ideas. I have studied them. I'm impressed by several of them, including Wittgenstein, including Comte, including the Vienna Circle that tried to combine ideas of Wittgenstein and Mach of the Mach number, and Boltzmann. You know, we get nowadays only limited, of course, knowledge of these great people. Not many people know that Boltzmann replaced Mach as a professor of philosophy in the University of Vienna. So they struggle with his ideas. It's interesting because Boltzmann actually could not make up his mind. So the natural question is, if these great minds have addressed these questions, do we have a chance to make any progress? In my opinion, the answer is certainly, unequivocally, yes, because we have an advantage. And what is the advantage? I always tell my students, my children, etc., when you try to go into a new area, always identify your advantage. You see, what is our advantage now? Our advantage now is the knowledge, or the beginning, or some knowledge of how the brain functions. And this is the key element. And I believe it is impossible to answer these deep questions without a deep foundation of neuroscience. It's interesting that, let me, if I may share my screen, it's interesting that Russell, the great Russell, Bernard Russell, was the first to appreciate this fact. So let me tell you what Russell said. So, you see, Russell, he was living at the time when the beginning of neuroscience was taking place, and Russell was very impressed by this new emergence of trying to answer this question. So Russell wrote, a physical process starts from, I cannot unfortunately read my screen. See, I have to get rid of some paraphernalia here, which don't allow me. There you go. Maybe. Thank you very much. So a physical process starts from a visible object, moves to the eye, there changes into another physical process in the optic nerve, and finally produces some effects in the brain simultaneously with which we see the object from which the process started, the scene being something mental, totally different in character from the physical processes which preceded it and accompanied it. This view is so queer that metaphysicians have invented all sorts of theories designed to replace it with something less incredible. Of course, we can talk a lot about the statement of Russell. it is clear that by metaphysicians, probably he means philosophers who don't understand science, etc. But for me, what is remarkable is that this statement of Russell betrays something which to a large extent still goes on, and this is the grand illusion that I'm referring to. Note that Russell claims that we see simultaneously. You see, in other words, Russell, of course, did not understand this relationship between unconscious and unconscious processes. So to emphasize the role of the unconscious and to try to explain what I mean by this grand illusion, let me start with a very, very simple example. My wife, Regina, enters my study in our house in Cambridge. As a result of intricate processes that are entirely unconscious, my brain perceives Regina. I will give some terminology now, and I will refer to the unconscious construction of this percept as the mental representation of Regina. About a third of a second later, my brain informs me of what it already knows, namely, my unconscious informs my conscious of the presence of my wife. At this moment, the first Big Bang takes place, namely the miracle of awareness. I perceive Regina. I will refer to the conscious construction of this percept as the mental image of Regina. So mental image is the Corson version, mental representation, the unconscious version. As soon as unconscious processes begin to construct the mental representation of my wife, these processes simultaneously form myriad of associations related to her. As a result of these associations, my unconscious decides that the proper way to greet Regina is "Good morning, my love." About a third of a second later, it instructs my consciousness to implement this decision. Regina's unconscious perceives this, etc. Mental images, which are three-dimensional holograms, are continuously updated, but they're always a third up to a half of a second behind reality. Consequently, the interaction with external environment in real time is paradoxically the task of the unconscious and not of consciousness. Indeed, it is intricate unconscious processes that allow us to walk, to drive without crashing, to hit or catch a ball, to perceive glimpses of colors, etc. For example, a trained athlete, following the unconscious instructions of his brain, begins to race very fast after about 0.1 to 0.15, depending on his training, of a second, following the sound of the starting pistol. The athlete erroneously believes that they began running as a result of becoming aware of the sound. This erroneous belief is what I refer to the grand illusion. Let us try now to go slightly deeper on how my brain and then myself perceive my wife. Visual perception is achieved via the process of deconstruction and reconstruction. For example, for the recognition of a specific percept, the brain's input is the light emitted from this percept, or more precisely, the distribution of the constituents of the light, the photons. As soon as the photons arrive at the retina, a complicated neural process is initiated that finally gives rise to the creation of the mental image of this object. This is the reason why Gerald Edelman, Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1972, writes, quote, "Every act of perception is an act of creation." In my opinion, the word creation should be replaced by reconstruction. Let me explain why reconstruction. A useful paradigm for appreciating this suggestion of reconstruction instead of creation is provided by the functional medical imaging technique called single photon computerized tomography, or SPECT. In what follows, I will discuss the employment of SPECT for the reconstruction of the three-dimensional object you see in this figure. This object is a phantom consisting of a fillable large component which plays the role of a background, where 6 fillable spheres of various diameters are placed. A two-dimensional diagram is also shown in this figure. In order to use SPECT to reconstruct this two-dimensional image, a radio tracer is placed inside the three-dimensional object. As a result of radioactive decay, the radiometers emits photons which are captured by the detectors. The SPECT machine scanner collects these photons and stores their distribution in a form which is known as sinogram. What is the inverse problem associated with the SPECT? The inverse problem is, given the sinogram, reconstruct this two-dimensional slide. This can be achieved through a very complicated formula. It's not important. For people that don't understand mathematics, it's not important at all. For people that do understand mathematics, let me just make a remark. The left-hand side is what is given through the data. The right-hand side involves the function f, which is what you need to reconstruct, but also involves this function mu, which is the X-ray attenuation coefficient, and which you obtain through CT. So because of this exponential, the inversion of this integral is quite complicated. You see, without this exponential, this is the classical Radon transform, and this was inverted by Radon in 1917. And this is the basis of analytical reconstructions for computerized tomography and for PET. But for SPECT, you have this additional exponential. And for many years, it was thought that this integral could not be inverted. Actually, finally, it was inverted by Roman Novikov following a technique which was introduced by Israel Gelfand and myself. And following this technique, you obtain this reconstruction, which you see in this picture above. Okay, so we see that is there a similarity of what the SPECT does and what the brain does? You see, the inverse problem of SPECT involves reconstructing this two-dimensional slide from the knowledge of the distributions of the photons emitted by the given object. But that's exactly the same data that the brain uses. Could it be that the brain uses analogous computations for the creation of the mental image of the percept? In my opinion, the answer to this question is strictly negative. For the reconstruction presented in this figure, the computer follows well-defined algorithmic steps, whereas the reconstruction implemented by the brain, in addition to utilizing the distribution of the emitted photons, relies crucially on prior information stored in appropriate neural circuits. This information, which is used in a highly dynamic way, has been created via earlier interactions with internal or external stimuli and has been stabilized via intricate processes involving memory. The precise mechanism which allows the brain to employ this prior information remains mysterium tremendum. In summary, visual perception involves the process of deconstruction and the solution of a complicated inverse problems. The latter solution is achieved via unconscious neural computations, which demonstrates the crucial importance of unconscious processes. Also, taking into consideration the time involved in implementing this reconstruction, it follows that awareness cannot be instantaneous. Hence, the statement of Russell that we see something mental simultaneous with the object we cause this mental image cannot be accurate. From the above discussion, it becomes clear that at least in visual perception, awareness is preceded by an unconscious process. Actually, this time sequence is apparently a fundamental feature of all mental processes. This leads to the first hypothesis, which is the following. Every conscious experience is preceded by an unconscious phase. I'm sure that many scholars of high cortical functions would accept this hypothesis, but I don't think it has ever been as clearly stated as it is here. The existence of an unconscious process is a necessary but not a sufficient requirement for the generation of a conscious experience. Indeed, not all unconscious processes lead to awareness. If a stimulus is too weak, too brief, or too noisy, then it is subliminal. Namely, it will be perceived by the brain, but it will not give rise to a conscious experience. Here is an example of a subliminal perception. You see the one on the right, you give a visual world for about 3 milliseconds, mask, and then you see this activation of the brain, which means that the brain perceives this word, but you are not aware of it. If this word stays there for a longer time, then finally it becomes visible. See, let us look slightly deeper at what happens, how this unconscious reconstruction is achieved. The mental representations of the constituents of a present are constructed via the solution of different inverse problems. In visual perception, in particular, the solution of such inverse problems reconstructs the orientation, color, and motion of a given percept. These reconstructions are achieved by employing unconscious neural computations of local neural networks that are in different parts of the brain. If the representation of the percept lasts for a sufficiently long time, then there will be a sufficient amount of incoming energy capable of exciting several of the local neural circuits associated with elements of this percept. This gives rise to a global activation that you saw earlier on the left part of the brain and the creation of a mental image. In summary, consciousness can be considered as the creation of a mental image which is generated following the global binding of the local neural circuits involved in the solution of the inverse problems associated with parts of a given percept. Of course, this connection, this continuum between unconscious and conscious processes not only happens in perception. A key part is played in its role in the so-called homeostasis. What is homeostasis? Life is maintained only when several conditions are simultaneously met in the interior of an organism. The process of maintaining a state necessary for survival and reproduction is called homeostasis. Emotions provide the response of the organism to a detected homeostatic disturbance in the structure or function of the viscera caused by the change of a specific physiological quantity. As you know, many organisms survive. They achieve homeostasis without awareness. However, at some stage in the evolution tree, the first Big Bang took place. Namely, the brain informed the organism that some homeostatic parameter was outside its optimal range. Presumably, this speculation, this involved pain, thirst, hunger, or temperature. Perhaps this primordial form of awareness constitutes the first instance of consciousness. It is important to emphasize, see, my colleague at USC, Antonio Damasio, is considered the world expert in feelings and emotions. So he's the one that introduces different names. So remember, I spoke about mental representation versus mental image. With respect to this particular case, Damasio suggested emotions to correspond to mental representations and feelings to correspond to mental image. So feelings are the conscious forms of emotions. However, it must be emphasized that emotions are much, much larger than feelings. And I don't have time to elaborate on it, but see, I'm in touch with somebody at Harvard, and they have now been able to decipher the neuronal mechanisms that control what happens after energy falls down. So this is detected by the decrease of lectin. And then you see the organism responds in two different ways. One is it creates the emotion of hunger, which finally gives rise to the feeling of hunger, which is very important because you eat, so you replenish some of this lost energy. But at the same time, the organism follows another procedure, of which we never become aware. Namely, it decreases energy expenditure. So emotions are hugely important, and but again, I don't have time to elaborate. Instead, I want to discuss something else, which is the second Big Bang. See, how do we differ? Why do we differ from other animals? After all, many other animals have consciousness. Obviously, a dog has consciousness and a cat has consciousness. So why are we different? Of course, we have the privilege of possessing language, which enriches enormously our capacity to communicate. For example, instead of the statement, "Good morning, my love," animals must use a variety of indirect ways to communicate their emotions. Many scholars have highlighted this great gift as the key difference between us and other creatures possessing consciousness. In my opinion, this is not entirely correct. In this respect, I would like to propose a second hypothesis. Namely, we possess a predisposition to construct real versions of our mental images and our mental representations, or at least to assign to them specific symbols. I have called the emerging constructions or symbols as re-representations. In other words, in my opinion, what differs us from other animals is our ability to construct re-representations. Some extremely important re-representations in addition to language are mathematics, technology, and arts. this is a very, very interesting question. And as you know, as you can see from this slide, not only, in my opinion, mental images give rise to representations, but mental representations also give rise to representation. In other words, it's possible to go directly from the unconscious to these constructions. And as a matter of fact, I believe that the higher the form of art, the less is affected by mental images. So this summarizes these two big bangs that I spoke about. So mental representations are the unconscious versions which give rise to mental images, the conscious versions, and then both mental representation and mental images give rise to representations, either in the form of symbols, which happens inside the brain, or in the forms of constructions, which happens outside the brain. This background that I have just elaborated provides, in my opinion, a very interesting and efficient way of trying to comprehend how we think, how we feel, etc. But in addition, it is important to emphasize not only this continuum of unconscious and conscious processes, but various notions which are fundamental because they reflect the way that the brain functions. And these are analogical thinking, ability to generalize, ability for abstraction, these dialectical pairs of unification versus reduction, local versus global processes, and simplicity versus complexity. In my book, which has the name Ways of Comprehending, I elaborate on each of these different notions or dialectic pairs. What I will do now is I will complete my talk by using the example of the emergence of cubism to elaborate on some of these notions. So one great notion for us as mathematicians is, but this is also how the brain works, is this notion of continuity. You see, Leibniz, in my opinion, who, as you know, was a great mathematician in addition to philosopher, was the first to elaborate on this. Leibniz used to say that nature doesn't jump. You see, the brain doesn't jump. So this continuity is extremely important and takes various forms. And one form of continuity is an attempt to follow the influence of how a new process emerges. Of course, sometimes this takes a nonlinear form, and it's very difficult to follow. In connection with cubism, it is not so difficult to follow because Picasso gave us a hint. Picasso said that that my one and only teacher is Cézanne. Let me find some notes. So, art can be defined as the creation and elucidation of relations. For Cézanne, this process is characterized more specifically. Namely, for Cézanne, it is not only the creation of relations in general, it is the creation of harmonious relations. In a letter written in the 1980, he writes, "Art is harmony parallel with nature." Of course, many other painters have spoken about harmony. For example, the founders of pointillism, Seurat and Signac, also emphasized harmony. But for them, harmony was achieved via the implementation of the scientific understanding of the laws of light and color. Specifically, Seurat declared that art is harmony, But for Cézanne, in contrast to them, the creation of harmonious relationships was simply the outcome of observing nature. As you know, Cézanne would just stay still and observe nature. We know that in the cognitive process of visual perception, the process of establishing relations is greatly aided by the geometrization of space. Taking these two facts together is not surprising that Cézanne advised another painter, Émile Bernard, the following: deal with nature as cylinders, spheres, cones, all placed in perspective so that each side of an object goes towards a central point. Interestingly, again, Cézanne emphasizing in this the relationships. There are two aspects of Cézanne's art that played a crucial role in Cubism. Both of them have not been sufficiently emphasized, in my opinion. One is passage. People that like music are aware of passage, but it is also important in painting. In painting, what is meant by is the ability to merge the foreground and background so that objects and background, so the objects and the background space become a fused continuum. In this way, the classical perspective introduced during the Renaissance is eliminated. There's a lot of writing by Braque giving credit to himself, Picasso, and Cézanne for going against this horrible mistake of Renaissance that Braque, when he discusses the perspective. There's the second aspect of Cézanne's work that it is useful for Cubism is the creation of perspectives that varied as painting were viewed from different angles. And this will be crucial for what I want to discuss now in the last couple of pictures about Picasso and Braque. As you know, the creativity of Picasso was mind-boggling. So after he completed his blue and rose period, etc., he tried to create a new style where paintings, which will be, as he was showed, without subject, silences. And this contemplation culminated with a well-known masterpiece of 1907 of the young ladies of Avignon. This painting, of course, was a crucial step towards the evolution for Cubism, again, following continuity. The one lady on the right has, as you see, this imposing mask-like face. The squinting lady provides the brilliant solution of the following conceptual problem posed and solved by the great artist: to depict simultaneously representations of entirely different viewpoints whose synthesis represents the given percept. This figure of the squinting lady represents the full frontal and profile views as seen simultaneously. What are the influences for this? Again, continuity. How did Picasso achieve this? He had several influences. One is already, I mentioned, Cézanne, that the ability that Cézanne had, that if you view his painting from a different angles, you'll see different things. In my opinion, the most important was from Poincaré. Poincaré wrote in his famous geometry book, the images of external objects are painted on the retina, which is a plane of two dimensions. These are perspectives. But as eye and objects are movable, we see a succession of different perspectives of the same body from different points of view. In the same way that we draw the perspective of a three-dimensional figure on a canvas, so we can draw that of a four-dimensional figure from different points of view. I think the hint to Picasso is clear. If you have seen this fantastic painting of our ancestor, El Greco, the opening of the fifth seal, you see immediately where Picasso took the overall pose, plus he was influenced by the 1862 painting of Ingres, the Turkish bath, which depicts several nude women in a Turkish bath. But there were three more facts that finally created, I'm finishing 5 minutes, that finally created this masterpiece. The one is the exhibition of 1906 by Matisse, The Joy of Life. Critics went crazy with this and they created the greatest achievement of this day. And of course, Picasso was extremely competitive. For Picasso, Matisse was the only real competitor. So he had to respond. But there was an additional huge influence, which was the masks that he saw from this exhibition of Louvre of the Iberian sculpture. These mask type faces, by the way, allowed him finally to conclude a portrait that he has struggled many years, which was the portrait of Stein. Now, I spoke about the ability of the brain to generalize. The brain's ability to generalize explain Picasso's attempts to go beyond the Iberian faces. For this, he had an additional crucial ingredient, African art. The African masks not only provided the natural conclusion of the reduction process that had begun with Iberian faces, but more importantly, they revealed to Picasso the necessity of employing the abstract language of geometry. Indeed, the multiple planes and edges of the masks, of the African masks, provided the perfect tools to solve the problem of the simultaneous views. In this way, Picasso not only completed the mask-like face of the standing lady on the right, but also could finally implement his transformative solution regarding the squatting figure. Finally, let's complete this talk with a synthesis achieved by Bragg. Bragg's far-reaching synthesis of Cézanne's passage and Picasso's geometrization provide, in my opinion, a fantastic example of the brain's ability to strive for synthesis, or if you like, for unification. Indeed, what was the goal of Bragg? His goal was, you remember, I talked about Cézanne passage. His goal was to push this to the limit, where not only perspective is completely eliminated, but also there is absolute fusion between the objects and the background. Bragg realized that Picasso's painting of the ladies was incomplete. Indeed, there is space between and behind these figures. However, at the same time, he realized that Picasso had invented the basic ingredient needed to fill the space, namely geometrical planes. Bragg sliced everything up into two-dimensional planes or layers and then reassembled them. In this way, the space between objects is eliminated, and at the same time, the objects and the background are represented in a completely geometrical form. To complete, I talk about local and global. I talk about simplicity and complexity. You can see that because if you focus at any piece, not only this, which is not a very complicated cubist creation, but if you go to the most complicated ones, you will see that they look very complex. But if you go locally, you will see that this complexity is nothing but the synthesis of local simple elements. I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Thanasi, for the wonderful and insightful talk. Maybe I can open the floor for questions, and then after we are maybe done with the questions on the talk, then maybe I can ask some sort of bigger scale or broader scale things. So let me open it up to the audience. You can maybe unmute yourselves and ask, or put something in the chat, and I'm happy to relay it, or Jeremy can relay it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the amazing talk. Extremely inspiring. And, you know, I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to listen to your talk. So thank you. My name is Maria Papadopouli, and I'm from University of Crete. I recognize that there are a few computer scientists and watching you, and some of them are PhD students. And I was wondering if you could, and you know, we are extremely excited because we see all these important questions between neuroscience and AI. And I was wondering if you can, from the perspective of computer science and mathematics, if you could state some nice PhD problems for our students at university.
No, you see. First of all, it's extremely kind that you made these nice remarks, and I'm truly grateful. You see, just because there are so many young people in the audience, let me just first say that in my life, I have achieved absolutely nothing without extremely hard work. This talk is, in a sense, the result of a hard work of 30 years. And by that I mean, you see, about 30 years ago, I realized that I needed to have break for mathematics, otherwise I was not very efficient. But you see, I work very hard. Of course, and I have this persecution of time. So I could not take 2 months off every year without doing anything. So I decided that I will take 2 months off from mathematics, doing absolute no mathematics, but I would do something very specific. So I dedicated myself to anything that had to do with brain, music, and painting, and at the beginning also with ancient Greeks. And this is how this sort of synthesis took place. Of course, my work always was helpful because, as you know, it gives you a different way of thinking. So this is how this synthesis was created. And if my first book on that, which is called Ways of Comprehending, most likely will be published by Penguin in the next few months, but it does not address what you asked me. This is in the second book, where I have several chapters on the connection with artificial intelligence. See, and this is an enormously interesting topic, because you see, again, I believe that in order to understand the connection between artificial intelligence and our intelligence, you have to, unfortunately, be an expert in both. You see, you have to be both an expert in computer science, that I'm not, and you also have to be an expert of how the brain works, which I begin to understand. You see, so I have written a lot about this. I'm enormously impressed by the possible implications of artificial intelligence, deep learning, especially into medicine. You see, maybe mathematics is my love, but medicine is my mistress. I love, you know, I'm very fond of medicine. And there are enormous, which I have a whole chapter in the second book discussing some of the applications of deep learning to medicine. So there is no doubt that artificial intelligence will have enormous impact on our lives in general, medicine in particular. But in my opinion, there are huge differences between artificial intelligence and our intelligence. And I could talk a lot about that. I just want to say 3 very quick things which have not been emphasized at all. One is that obvious, absolutely obvious thing, that the brain is embodied. Of course, the brain is a body. What have I told you? Nothing. But this is missed. The hormones, etc., the guts, all these things affect the brain enormously. So this is one fact which is not taken seriously by artificial intelligence. The second part is the lateralization. Again, I have a very specific chapter on my book, what the left and the right brain do. And the third is the glia cells. The glia cells for many years were the poor neighbors or the poor relatives, but the glia cells are enormously important, which should have been, because, you know, in terms of numbers, the ratio of glia cells to neurons are 6:1. By the way, Einstein, apparently his main advantage, when they looked at his neurons, they couldn't find anything different other than he had many more glia cells. So this also is something which is not taken into consideration. So unfortunately, I don't think that I have sufficient expertise to propose problems. What I would say is that there will be enormous progress in this direction, but if you maybe the best way is to achieve a synergy between artificial intelligence and our intelligence, this neurotrophic circuits, etc. And to achieve this, it will be a very good investment to go towards neuroscience.
Thank you, Athanassios. That was very interesting. I think Tassos also has a question. So Tassos, you maybe can go.
My dear friend Tassos, you promised a difficult question, Tassos.
I think you're muted, Tassos. Tassos, you're muted.
Okay. My question is this. Is the unconscious process the same for all of us? In other words, can some people learn to have a more informative subconscious process? For example, artists.
Of course.
That's it. People who are well-versed in different topics, science and music. Can they be expected to have a more informative type of unconscious process?
1,000%. 1,000%. Of course. You see, the unconscious, the fact that we're not aware of it, it doesn't mean that it is not the brain has plasticity, and part of the brain is the unconscious. So of course, the conscious has plasticity. Completely we change. I used to I haven't done this experiment, but it would be an interesting experiment consistent with your suggestion. I mean, I think your question was at the same time, it was a rhetoric question. I think you gave the same answer. You see, as you know, there's a question of free will, because following these fantastic experiments of Libet, when Libet, if you think of the experiments of Libet within what I already told you, there is no surprise, because I suggested that before any conscious experience, there is an unconscious phase, which means before the conscious experience that I have decided to lift my hand, there must be an unconscious phase, which means my brain has already decided to lift my hand. And this is what Libet saw, to go fast. And people, the philosophers start to say, oh, but what is this? Then there's free will, etc. Of course, there is no such a problem, because my unconscious and conscious processes are me. They're not different. And I used I gave the example that if you drive and you see a cow, you brake, and you within 0.2 or whatever, 1.5 milliseconds, and you think that you brake because you saw the cow. No, you brake because your brain saw it. But I'm absolutely sure that if you live in India, you will brake faster, because your brain knows that cow is a holy animal there. So of course, and not only artists affect their unconscious, but remember, I alluded to, in my opinion, the higher the form of act, the less the pollution by consciousness.
Yes, and in this way, we can hope to improve ourselves also by learning more about art, teaching us about many different topics. Then we can really improve the way our subconscious appreciates the world.
You see, no doubt about this. But you see, don't forget, there's enormous beauty, enormous knowledge, etc. in the unconscious. The basic question is, How do we get
how to reach it?
How to reach it? This is, you see, I'm scared. Tassos, you know, my friend, so I confess to you, I'm scared of my unconscious. In the following sense, you see, I wake up sometime, Regina knows, Regina, my wife, knows this. I would wake up sometimes in a very bad mood, for no reason. Why I'm in a bad mood? I'm in a bad mood because all night I was thinking about Lindelof conjecture. And my unconscious realized that I had made a mistake. And because the unconscious is much closer to emotions, then the unconscious informs my emotions that I made my mistake. And this puts me in a bad mood. And indeed, a few hours later, I also become aware that I had made a mistake. So this really is a scary thing. If I get up in a bad mood, and this is premonition. This is the premonition that we were thinking, oh, I have a premonition. What means premonition? Premonition means that your conscious inform your emotions that something is not right.
All right. So I think Dimitris Kouyoumdis also has a question. So Dimitri, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. It's very interesting and stimulating, and it's nice to have such talks. We don't have often such talks. But my question is more down to earth, not so much about the philosophical approach of this. Can you elaborate about the evidence that we have for this? Do we have experiments? Because you also refer to some specific times. Can you say something about this as well, about the evidence, analytical evidence or empirical evidence that we have about these two different phases?
Of course. Okay, so first of all, I disagree that it's philosophical. It has nothing to do with philosophical. Everything I said is enormously practical. Everything I said is enormously down to earth and practical. Of course, I cannot. If you look at my book, all these conclusions as the result of concrete experiments. Now we know exactly, as I said, Libet originally made these tremendous experiments where this point 3.5, I said, it doesn't come from my mind, it comes for concrete experiments. The fact that you lose information, for example, when you go from unconscious to conscious, it is this Nobel caliber experiment of our compatriot, Nikos Logothetis. Nikos Logothetis studied binaural rivalry. Binaural rivalry means what? It means that if I give you on your left and right visual field two different images, what will you see? I give you on your left visual field a house, and on the right visual field a river. What do you think you will see? You will see the two images alternating. You see, this was a well-known fact, and many people tried to explain it. All the great people actually did, and this was finally understood at the neuronal level by Logothetis and his collaborators, who trained monkeys to be able to tell them if they see what they see, and then they had single neural measurements, and they saw that in the primary, in the optical cortex, they could see both, which means that unconscious. That's why I always say that the brain knows much more than we do. The brain sees both images. The brain perceives both images. But then when you go to higher cortical functions, you see consciousness needs a very nice, a very complete picture. And this is the problem, of course. In order to achieve this, you lose information. So there is enormous experimental evidence. But of course, I cannot give it in a 40-minute talk.
Right. I can maybe take advantage of my own sort of position as moderator to ask you a couple of more maybe mathematical questions, Athanassios. So one is about your transformation and sort of the fact that you said that there is sort of like the unconscious part and the things that we have from before. I'm wondering if we should think of our calculations or our brain processing as in some way Bayesian, in the sense that there is a prior distribution of sorts, and then there is kind of the data that we measure given the prior distribution, and then the images that we form, the mental images that we form, have this kind of Bayesian type format where both the prior distribution and the mental representations are kind of coming into play. That's one question. And the other question is, you mentioned a little bit about energy decrease for homeostasis, and you also had this paradigm with the words. And I'm just wondering whether interpolation or extrapolation kind of come into play in these ideas, in this sort of processes or physical processes that you utilize, and whether you've thought a little bit of that, because you had this thing with the masked pieces of the words and then the pieces that were available, and then whether we perceive the words based on whether there is some masking and some availability. And I'm just wondering whether interpolation and extrapolation kind of come into play within that.
You see, first of all, of course, as soon as I use the word this prior information, when I talk about the difference between the computer and us, it is natural to raise the question you raised. So, and also interpolation, extrapolation. But you see, I tend not to think in this way. I tend not to think this way because, in some sense, I believe it. You see, we have bias. We have bias as mathematicians, which I try to avoid. There's this well-known book, Bach, Gödel, etc. And I think this book sort of. I mean, your question is consistent with this, and this, in my opinion, reverses the problem. The question is not to use mathematics to explain how the brain works, but to use how the brain works in order to understand mathematics. These questions you raise, I mean, are the result of how the brain works. You know, the brain understands statistics. This is incredible. This is incredible. What do I mean by the brain understands statistics? It means that this Bayesian approach should be the other way around. They did some experiments in babies, and the babies understood statistics. This is, for me, mind-boggling. What do I mean by that? Just because some person in the audience earlier talk about experiments. You see, we can understand if a baby is surprised by how long the baby looks at something. So if the baby looks at his or her mother for a certain amount of time, if there's a stranger, would look at much longer. So the surprise for the baby, the cognitive surprise, can be measured by how long you look. So what they did, they put three green balls and a red ball, and they mix them, and then the baby saw that, and then you saw the ball coming down. If the ball was, I said, three red and a green, if the ball was red coming down, no problem. If it was green, the baby would look careful, would look surprised. So these ideas, so mathematics is built as a result of how the brain functions, not the other way around. So I hesitate to make this kind of connections, extrapolations, interpolations, etc. I prefer to concentrate on how the brain functions, and if something is done by the brain, it is important. Mathematics is important because mathematics reflects seminal mechanisms of how the brain works. The brain tries to establish relations, associations, relations. Mathematics builds a very rigorous and very efficient language for implementing this. That's why mathematics is so important. But there are many things we can say. I shouldn't monopolize the time.
All right. So Vasilis Basios has a question. So Vasily, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Hi. Again, I have to add my admiration and great inspiration that comes from your lecture. Once more, congratulations and thank you. May I ask you to comment to the other approach where it sees brain basically quantum based? I'm referring to work of Penrose and Hameroff, and I was wondering if you have some insights.
Of course. Again, thank you very, very much for your kind words. And you know, I have read many books on higher cortical functions, maybe all the great people I have read, you see, and all of them dismiss Sir Roger. I know Sir Roger very well. We have discussed with him. And I believe that my book in the last chapter, 23, is the only place where there is a serious attempt to answer Sir Roger's point of view. I disagree with it, but at least there's a very serious position on this. You see, Sir Roger, I remember reading, first of all, his books 20 years ago or something like that. And at the time, you see, and of course, as you know, I'm biased also toward mathematics, physics, etc. But they're not correct, in my opinion. But they're not correct. The reason is, it is remarkable that Sir Roger makes logical errors, which I try to decipher. You see, it's a long discussion, so I will not do it now. But just roughly, I want to tell you the following, that the essence of Sir Roger's thought is that the brain has the ability to think non-algorithmically, okay? Which is absolutely correct. There's no doubt about this. But then therefore he says, okay, the brain thinks non-algorithmically. Do we know something that is non-algorithmic? Yes, quantum gravity. Therefore, quantum gravity must be related with consciousness. And there are conceptual errors in this. First of all, I'm not sure that quantum gravity is non-algorithmic. He makes an attempt there. As you know, Penrose was never happy with quantum mechanics to begin with. But then he talks about quantum gravity. The fact that, as you know very well, we don't have unification yet, and we don't have an algorithmic way to describe that. Doesn't mean that there is not such an algorithm, but there are conceptual problems in his analysis, plus, of course, practical problems in terms of scales. So I don't think his position is correct, but it is serious, and it should be treated as such, and it was not treated until now, until this chapter 23 of my book.
Looking forward to read your chapter then.
Very kind of you. It is written very well. It is absolutely clear, etc., etc. So you will follow it easily.
Okay, Maria, you had another comment. Sorry, just share the time. Go ahead, Maria.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. A very quick question. So, like noise, I think that noise and sparsity, but especially noise, probably contributes a lot in the imagination, right? Like trying to optimize to find the global minimum, the global solutions, like in annealing. And I was wondering, and perhaps also sparsity helps, like also winner takes all, etc. So I was wondering if you could comment about your favorite principle that contributes in creativity and in the imagination.
My favorite, I'm sorry, I missed the word.
Your principle in neuroscience that contributes in being creative and using the imagination, maybe killing the loops, as a computer scientist would say also.
You see, by the way, it's amazing how life is. You see, I just completed writing a book with Efthymios Kaxiras, who is the head of physics department at Harvard right now.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the last chapter involves annealing, which I was proofreading it just an hour ago, you know. So it's a tremendous coincidence. But going back to your question, you see, in the second book, I make an attempt to address this question of creativity. You see, and as you know, they have made concrete experiments about how people solve problems. And there are two different ways of solving problem. One is this eureka moment comes out of nowhere, And the second, and the second is following very logical procedures. And of course, you would prefer this eureka moment because this is what you think it's unexpected, etc. Of course, if I knew how to be creative, I would do it. I would apply it to myself. I have my best ideas personally have come always, and also the time when I discover my errors come just when I'm waking up, which is a small window you have to your unconscious. So I think if you have ways to submerge into your unconscious, certainly you will become more creative. Of course, Dali and all these people knew this, had tried, but in my opinion, unsuccessfully. Contemplation is extremely important. Walks are very important. All these obvious things are very important. This book that I wrote was written because of the lockdown. I was walking every day, and during the walk, many ideas come to my mind. And free yourself from all gadgets. You see, I watch movies with my children, my 3 children. None of them, I have three beautiful children. None of them can watch fully a movie without being interrupted by looking at their mobiles. This is terrible, in my opinion. You see, you need freedom. You see, so there are many different things. But on the other hand, you know, the young people now have much stronger tools than we used to. So maybe via computing, the society will solve this lack of ability to concentrate, to contemplate, to be free, etc. But I'm not sure.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Achilles has a question. Achilles Tsortos. Achilles.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for the talk. If we go back to the painting thing, do you, given that artificial intelligence nowadays can produce paintings that are hardly discernible from those being made by humans, do you see this as a success of AI or as a problem for the human creativity definition?
No. This is, of course, an extremely good question. It's extremely good question. And I don't. It is certainly a success of AI. Anything that mimics a higher cortical function is a great success. It's not a problem, neither with painting nor with music. You see, it will be interesting. As you know, Roth, there's people that cry when they see this. You know, Malevich, who was his predecessor, when he came to reduction, you see, why do we like, why do we like Mondrian? Why do we like Malevich? We like, in my opinion, these people because they use reduction. Namely, they reduce everything to lines and color. And as I mentioned briefly in my talk, lines, color, and movement are the basic ingredients that the brain uses to decompose a percept. So this is some fundamental process. And these people realized this, implemented it, and we connect, and therefore we like it. So is there something fundamental coming out of artificial intelligence? I haven't studied enough to know. Probably yes. And if it happens, it will be very, very interesting. But I don't think it subtracts from people's creativity. Talking about painting, I'm personally worried because I haven't seen anything fantastic except for some individual. A few individuals since abstract expressionism. So while music I see all the time, painting I'm not sure. So painting, there is stagnation. So maybe artificial intelligence is a way forward. I don't know.
With poetry, this is, in my opinion, certainly a problem, isn't it? Poetry is poetry.
Yeah.
written by computers and written by humans, this is a big pain. I don't know if there are devices or algorithms or whatever, and I'm not a computer scientist, but to separate, to tell the difference who made what.
No.
And this is true for music and for painting too. I mean, if I have in my mind Margaret Boden's book about creativity.
I know the book. No, I know the book. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. This is a serious problem. And you see, I always try to look at the positive side. Maybe through this process, to go back to the earlier question, maybe we will learn something about creativity. I don't know. All these are very, 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 very interesting points.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. If there are no more questions, I know we kept our distinguished speaker a quarter of an hour more than what we intended.
No problem.
I know.
Go ahead, Tasso.
If I just make, regarding to the previous question, there was a movement basically in the middle of last century of superrealism in poetry. Hyperrealismos, of what was called automatic writing by great poets, foreign as well as Greek poets. And when you read the account of Elitis or Seferis when they speak about superrealism, is that they respect it very much because it seems to them that the unconscious is what is important, to let free thoughts of your mind that are not connected necessarily by some logical process. And it comes out as an expression of the unconscious. That was realized at the time.
Very good point.
Yeah.
Very good point.
All right.
Thank you, Athanassios. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think it's a great place to stop. There were many more questions. Maybe we can actually ask Athanassios to answer some of the more standard questions at a separate, place and post them on the website or something like that, because we would like to have, I think Maria mentioned about some opportunities for young people like PhDs and so on, and there were more questions to that effect, and we would love to hear Athanassios' viewpoint, but I wanted to keep the questions focused, as I think Athanassios kind of preferred, on the scientific part of the talk, because there were many interesting questions to that effect. So let me stop here by thanking you all, especially thanking Athanassios for his wonderful insights and his inspiring talk, and mention that you will hear more from the HDAA about the next lecture, which is planned for May. And thank you all again for listening and for coming in. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.